think about what you would frame as the best places on Earth, places you've been, places you want to be, places you've read about. Imagine those places somewhere on Earth, and you can make as many as you wish. I'll take a minute and let you think about that. And when you have that population of protected areas, pick out one that says, out of that pool that I just said, the one I would really like to go to, the one I've been to, the one I treasure, this is the one that I think is really superb. Now think about that particular place and say why. What are the attributes? What are the things? What makes that place your treasured place? What are the attributes that make it that? That place is at serious risk. There are influences like climate change, human incursion, invasive species, a whole range of things that are impacting that spot. They're going to change the characteristics of that spot. UNESCO, as an agency of the UN, identifies a series of criteria by which we decide what are World Heritage Sites, and by definition also by other internationally protected areas. There are three major categories: World Heritage Sites. Some are cultural, some are natural, some are mixed. A cultural ones like the Mona Lisa, Statue of Liberty. A natural one would be Wind Cave National Park or Yosemite or something like that as an example. But there are also Ramsar sites, biosphere reserves. All those kind of things are internationally designated protected areas. To be a World Heritage Site, as a natural World Heritage Site, this particular place must meet one of these four criteria. So I'll just, but no more, won't bother to read those to you, but there are those four, any one of those four criteria, and many sites meet more than one. There's also a category called mixed, which means it meets one of these criteria as well as some of the, there are 9 other criteria for cultural sites. So a mixed site means some cultural, some natural sites. So that's what we are qualified to as a World Heritage Site. A Ramsar site says it's a wetland, and well, you know, we're advancing wetlands for people to enjoy. It's a pretty fuzzy definition of what are the criteria one would use to decide it's a wetland. IUCN is the body, the scientific body that advises UNESCO. IUCN says we go evaluate wetlands or natural heritage sites or wherever, apply certain criteria and say we therefore propose to UNESCO that this site does meet these criteria and it should qualify. And the third group is called biosphere reserves. And if you contrast this with the definition of Ramsar sites, these are much better, much more tightly defined. So looking at things like integration of people in nature, better ways to look at the way society changes and therefore the way the landscape changes. Interestingly, among all these 3 categories, this is the only one that says we recognize that human valuation is dynamic. So what humans would value at a particular time is different than what they would value later. The World Heritage Commission was established in 1972. So for about 50 years, it has been active in governing these sites, using them for advertising, supplying money for research, supplying money for management, supplying money for proper management to guide against things like invasive species or whatever. So UNESCO is the body in the UN that handles all this. IUCN does the scientific advising to get it there. So among these 3 categories, there are about 3,500 sites in the world that are designated as internationally designated protected areas. And they are, that's the distribution of them among countries and among the different sites. There are something less than around 275, about 270 natural heritage sites. And that's the ones I'm going to talk most about. The comments I'm going to offer to you today address all 3 of these categories, but I'll focus most on the natural heritage sites. So when we talk about internationally designated, when I talk about internationally designated protected areas, it's these categories that are set up by UN, advised by IUCN, and so therefore they qualify as this. And yet we have in all countries, national parks, some very large ones, some small ones, some places that society, that nation has decided are really marvelous, that they offer great value to society, and therefore we set them aside as national parks and we want people to use them, treasure them, and so forth. So although there are 3,500 internationally designated ones, there's a whole bunch more protected areas that are not internationally designated and yet meet a lot of the criteria for what we think we value. UNESCO's words for these natural world heritage sites specifically are, these sites are unique. Each individual site is unique, and they're so precious that each individual site must be conserved for all humankind forever. And that's the crux of my argument right there, is that is impossible. You can't have a place that arrived at this conditions for landscape evolution and say, hold it, stay right there, don't move now. Forever, we're going to keep you just like you are because we like you. That, to me, is absurd. And that's going to be the core of my argument. So, when a particular site is ready for nomination, the country where that site is located develops a group of people, scientists and non-scientists, social science people, gather all kinds of data. It takes about a 10-year process to gather data about that particular site. At that time, they call an ICN and say, we want an IUCN team to come look at why we think this meets the criteria. These are the criteria from a UNESCO list that we think it meets. IUCN evaluates those, take that to a UNESCO body, which is the World Heritage Commission. The commission evaluates that and says we agree or don't agree or whatever. So the World Heritage Commission met last week, and they meet yearly to say we consider new sites, we consider different management actions of all sites that are already listed and so forth. Well, I think we have a problem here. And two examples that I'll bring up frequently here in the next little bit are the Great Barrier Reef and Venice. And the examples I'm using are, we have these places that arrived at their condition through landscape evolution. And that means climate, geology, species movement, all kinds of things that drive the condition of a landscape. We have a series of criteria that were established by society. Most of these criteria were set up in 1972, and then frequently they've been modified just a little bit, changed a little bit, language changed a little bit as societal values change. UNESCO claims they use the same criteria, constant language throughout, but they don't. The words have changed somewhat. Available interpretations have changed. So in Venice, for example, they've said the water quality of the Venice Lagoon is such that you do not meet the criteria for World Heritage anymore. So therefore, you are a World Heritage site in danger. Oh, you can't do that. No, this is really serious. I mean, we're spending a huge amount of money to try to manage our cruise ships differently, because if you say we're a World Heritage site in danger, then we run the risk of reducing our tourist trade. It'll cost us a tremendous amount of money. And UNESCO says, well, yes, I understand that. But here's the water quality, we measured it, it's criteria, you don't meet them. You're a World Heritage site in danger. You can't do that. No, this is serious. You can't do this. And so finally, at the end of the meeting last week, they said, well, Venice said, I'll tell you what, we will work really hard to manage our cruise ships differently. You've said that annually for the last 20 years. Yeah, but we really will. We'll. And so the commission said, all right, you're right. But you're not a site in danger yet, but you will be pretty soon. And the Great Barrier Reef has been the same way. Don't mess with us because it'll be very expensive if you call us a site in danger. And so my argument is that's going to continually occur at all these World Heritage sites because the world is changing. It's landscape evolution, it's climate change. The world is changing. You can't keep a static view. So when we face these conditions, that is, as that landscape evolves, maybe as our criteria evolve, we have a dilemma that we can say, well, it doesn't meet the criteria anymore. Therefore, maybe we just delist it. So never mind, you're not a listed World Heritage site. In fact, maybe you're not even a protected area, or maybe you're just a nationally protected area. Or we say, well, we think you're pretty important and it's nice to have you on the list. Venice is a famous place. Therefore, we'll relax the criteria a little bit and let you slide through, which seems absurd if you're going to have criteria we apply them. So it seems to me that we have a dilemma in which we say the site doesn't meet criteria. We have to manage in some way to address that problem, which they've done routinely and ineffectively so far. I claim that this situation is a wicked problem. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with wicked problems, but there are certain criteria that qualify a situation as being wicked. I'll tell you each of the four and tell you why I think this situation qualifies. One of them is that values, the things that our stakeholders value, and therefore the words that go into our criteria, okay? Yeah. Change through time. So, for example, if you think about this definition of World Heritage and so forth, 1972 is when the commission was established. Today, we have World Heritage sites being considered. They're not the same words we used in 1972. And if you back up through deep history, you have the example is here, the Incans or the Romans or the Dakota Sioux. They would use very different words than we would use today. It's ridiculous to say these words that qualify as criteria are constant through time. Second, we have a landscape that's evolving, criteria that's evolving, and therefore, when we try to apply the criteria to our World Heritage Site condition, it's a continually changing target. So we have criteria that are evolving through time as societal values change, and we're applying it to a place on the ground which is changing, and we're asking if that place meets those criteria. Well, often it doesn't, because it's a continually changing situation. If we look at our World Heritage sites, ones we're considering nominating for World Heritage listing, we say, well, we don't have really enough data to determine whether or not this site meets the criteria. And yet, we collect data on that, and it's a moving target because the landscape is changing as we go along. More slowly, but also accurately, the criteria we use for the listing are changing. And so therefore, if we just wait, then the condition changes and we don't have enough data. We don't have the correct data. If we collect data now, then the data are ineffective when we finally get to the listing condition. So we have this conflict in values. We have a situation where society says, you are the World Heritage people. You're the ones that know about this. You meaning IUCN or some person who works on a World Heritage condition. Figure this out. Give us the right answer so we know when a place is listed or should be listed. And there are no right answers. So society gets frustrated with the fact that this thing called the World Heritage Commission and the people advising it can't develop a straight answer and tell us who does and does not meet the criteria. Fifth, we pick these sites as being unique. They qualify as unique places on Earth and demonstrate these particular sets of criteria. But because of that, we can't collect data at one site and apply it to another one. So each site is unique, means we can't learn from one setting and go to another one, and therefore can't generalize. 6, when we look at management of these sites, we oftentimes need to implement various management strategies, such as animal movement or tourist movement or something. And yet, every site is a risky behavior because we have a unique site. And if we misjudge that, if we apply the wrong management strategies, then we risk losing some attribute of the site, like a big animal population or something like that. So because the site is unique, because the animal populations are unique, if we make a mistake, we've made a risky error. And then finally, this is the best we can do. We have the best people involved as far as we know. We don't know anything better that can be done differently. So although all those other 6 criteria say you're not going to be able to get a correct answer, number 7 says, well, that's the best you're going to get, so just wing it. Go forward and take the best you can do and try to make it work. Well, if you look at these internationally designated protected areas, they qualify, it's about somewhere here. I'll get to it in a minute. Anyway, so 1.5% of the world's protected areas are all internationally designated. And that means Ramsar, Biosphere Reserve, World Heritage, and so forth. So it's the most restricted category of protected area that we have. And we said, we have criteria that we apply to this landscape. We have a landscape condition, and we express that as meeting the criteria. Now is a listed site, and now we don't want anything to change. So we view that status quo as the optimal situation. So we tell our managers, don't touch a thing. Do as little as possible, but as much as necessary to keep it just like that. So rather than allowing the landscape to evolve, keep it as static as possible to continue to maintain and meet those criteria. And yet, of course, as I mentioned a couple of times, landscapes evolve, societal positions evolve, so they've changed through time. So it's ridiculous, in my view, that we try to keep a static target and apply moving criteria to it. which means that as we go forward with this collection of 175 natural World Heritage sites, there's a declining probability that those sites will continue to meet the criteria applying to them. We have a building problem here where progressively all kinds of things like species movement, human incursion, climate change, all those kind of things are going to cause the site to degrade from the perspective of meeting the criteria we're trying to apply to it. Another problem with approaching it this way is that we have scientists in the US, Western Europe, Canada, who are the ones mostly responsible for applying these criteria, developing the criteria. And we're all used to objective Western science. So we approach this whole problem through a Western lens. So all the stuff I'm going to tell you when I get to my definition of how I think we solve this problem is going to be a whole bunch of things like monitor and evaluate and measure things. And so I'm using the same system. And it's all this Western lens kind of an idea. And when we say we're going to be inclusive, we're going to try to use non-Western lens as well. We say we have a bunch of stakeholders in the room. By the way, some of them are indigenous people. Aren't we proud? So it's a statement where we say, look how well we're doing because we have some of those people in the room, rather than saying we actually weave together some of the people who are different than us and try to use a different approach to defining where we're going with this. So I think that an approach to solving this problem, is through this thing we're calling adaptive heritage. So I'm going to tell you what I think that is and how I think it's applied. I'm also going to tell you that it's an emerging idea. There are still things about this adaptive heritage idea that are not ready to be applied on the ground yet. I think there's still work to be done. The managerial guidance that we give managers of these sites is do as little as possible, but no more than necessary to keep that site static. And that I don't think is appropriate. So one problem with this idea is that a World Heritage site has a particular bound defined around it. And the people managing that site have an influence, at least, if not some control, over conditions in the site. They do not have control over conditions outside the site. So my favorite example of this is the Great Barrier Reef, where for some short distance offshore, there are coral reefs, there are fish, islands, all kinds of populations, and so forth. And right onshore, there are a whole bunch of sugar factories. And the sugar factories are producing effluent and discharging the effluent out into the water. And I talked to UNESCO and said, well, you have to have a landscape approach, and you have to look at the whole landscape, including the sugar factories and the Great Barrier Reef, water quality, and say, how do you build values here so you're able to protect the values of the reef as well as allow people to produce sugar? We can't do that. We have no control over the sugar factories, therefore we only worry about the reef. Well, you can only worry about the reef so long, it's not going to be a reef any longer. You're producing effluent, which is degrading the reef, and you're ignoring it, so you can't do that. So this idea of a managing a World Heritage site in a landscape configuration. There's a problem with that, and that the problem is that we have a group of people who are recruited to be managers of World Heritage conditions. Like any person working in a bureaucracy, working for an institution, they're judged against particular performance criteria. So we expect you to do certain things. These people working in this situation, they're expected to do things like manage tourist flows, manage animal populations, try to maintain as close as possible to the original criteria UNESCO used to list this site. And so therefore they say, I don't want to be judged whether or not the sugar factories are degrading water quality. I have no control over that. So therefore, I don't want to be judged by that. So we're telling them you have to manage this bigger landscape configuration, and in a bureaucratic sense, that's risky behavior. There's hesitation. Well, a way to approach this, which we're trying to get into the adaptive heritage idea, is managing these sites as socio-ecological systems, trying to weave together the biophysical environment and the social system. Part of the idea of that is that we recognize explicitly that the criteria are changing through time. So it's a dynamic system. So the phrase used in SES context is it's a learning landscape. It's a place where human values are changing, the human populations are changing, and therefore the values we ascribe to that place to decide whether or not it meets the criteria for listing is also changing. So we have a changing situation. Asking people to do that is institutionally risky. That is, if this is a person who's responsible to be a World Heritage Site manager, we're asking them to take risky behaviors, and they say, no, thanks, I'm not interested. The way we manage using SES logic is to say there are attributes on the ground of things like animal populations or water flows or aesthetics, and view those as flows, view those as movements of matter and energy through that landscape. Identify those, identify the values people have in dealing with those. And then use scenario planning to say, if we carry out these actions on the ground, what's likely to happen to animal populations, animal movement, water flows or erosion, tourist flows, and therefore go back to the stakeholders and address what would make this a viable situation, how would we get this done, and then repeatedly do that. That's the same logic you'll hear in a moment. I'll tell you more about the same logic. That's adaptive management, same idea. So as I go through this now, I'm going to tell you that there are 6 tenets that we believe qualify, we make up this idea of adaptive heritage. And I'm going to tell you that there's at least one place on Earth where every one of these, there's at least one place on Earth where each of these, I can't say it, I can't hear. For every one of these attributes I'm going to talk about, I can find a place where it's applied on the ground. But there is no place where all of them are applied on the ground. Took a while to get around that. So what I'm arguing is dynamic criteria, dynamic landscape, and they're at risk. We need to find a way to fix it. All the stuff about both the Great Barrier Reef and the events that took place last week are characteristics of that. The Great Barrier Reef comment to the commission has been, we're spending a huge amount of money to try to manage fish populations, manage coral reef bleaching, manage tourism, so that we continue to meet criteria. If you call us a site in danger, we'll lose money. You can't call us a site in danger, it's too expensive. And the commission has said, yep, we'll buy that. You are no longer a site in danger. You have 2 years to collect data and show us that you're managing well, you're going to meet the criteria, which I think is flawed. Yes, it's a place that has lots of flaws with it. So I'm going to tell you about these 6 criteria, and I'm going to try to place in the ground what each one's applied. The first one is adaptive management. Well, all these criteria will be familiar to you because they're things that all of us do all the time individually. So there are 6 of them, and I'll tell you which one. So the idea with adaptive management will be frame goals, carry out actions, involve the stakeholders in deciding what goals are there, evaluate it, and try again. But we always fail, but we can get pretty close, and we try it again. That, I think, builds a culture of accountability between the individuals managing the site and people in the landscape, the community around the World Heritage Site. Fraser Island is in New Zealand, an example of a place where they actively do that. They have meetings with stakeholders and actively engage with stakeholders in assessing what do we want to do, what action should we take to get there, how did it work out, where did we fail, let's try again, and repeatedly going after it. That requires that the people in the landscape surrounding that area understand that this is risk management. These are not decisions that we can take, implement, and be all done. We're going to fail when we try these. So there needs to be active involvement with the community. Shiratoko is a site in Japan that uses a practice called co-management, of actually working with the local community to say what management strategies can be put in place and what management strategies from the community perspective would make a difference in what happens on site. Second, transparency and accountability. So being transparent with the community and with UNESCO stakeholders and with global stakeholders. You and I are all stakeholders of all these World Heritage Sites in the sense that we're all members of a world community. The people who live closer to the World Heritage Site have more involved and more to lose. But the idea in this area is that we recruit people like ISCN to help assess the criteria and build a monitoring program that would say, how do you tell if the criteria were met? The Great Barrier Reef is an example of that, linking together the dive community, the tourist community with IUCN to say, what are the attributes we're trying to meet? What strategies are we using to get there? Where did we fail? Where do we try again? I think that by doing that, we build in stakeholder involvement so the stakeholders recognize that we don't succeed each time, but it's an active engagement. So it's a communication process where they say, we understand what's happening here. It's going well. We're going to continue it again. This is one of my favorite pictures. This thing up here is a knife. And my brother wanted me to tell you, the person in the boat did not send me this picture. Anyway, Sundarbans, Bangladesh is an example of a place where transparency and accountability is practiced aggressively by building together communities of stakeholders and management on site to say, what are we trying to do here? How do we encourage the people, the community stakeholders, to hold us accountable for our actions? That requires that we have monitoring and evaluation data. And this is one of my examples of, I think, where I'm using this Western lens. I think that when I say monitoring and evaluation data, I mean social values, landscape condition, physical things, biophysical things. I think there are many attributes here that could be woven into this from an indigenous perspective, a non-Western perspective, that would provide better data than I'm able to use here. But that's not woven into my thinking about this yet. But Angkor Wat is a place in Cambodia that uses just that. That uses this idea of stakeholders and the community together to say, what data should we collect? How often do we collect the data? To whom do we report it? And how do we base actions on those data as we go forward? That requires that we pay attention to this idea that both landscape condition and societal values are changing. And the idea that societal values are changing is not woven into any part of the UNESCO criteria so far. They pretend that 50 years ago we built criteria, they work well, we're hanging on to them. That's not true. East Brunel is a place in the Western Pacific that is an example of that continually uses an aggressive monitoring evaluation system to ask about social conditions, fish conditions, fish harvest rates, and then try to weave that back into some data that say, if that's what we wanted to do, there's the data to say we succeeded or not, what actions do we take next to try it again? Adaptive management kind of an idea. For all of those ideas to be successful, they need to be woven into governance. So we're not just collecting data and talking to the community about how we did or did not succeed in our goals. That actually has to be a governance process in which the local community is associated with the management staff of the World Heritage Site and then use that to build the governance. That includes this idea of being out in the landscape and so forth. Eastern Liso in South Africa uses a co-management structure like I mentioned before, and they actually have local people from the community outside the World Heritage Site, as well as site managers, to say together, what are we doing here? What's successful? How successful is it? What's not? That requires that we continue to recognize that valuation is changing. So the economic value of a tourism experience or the societal value of a unique place where biodiversity is conserved on site. There are values associated with that. Some are economic, some are expressed perceptually, and that needs to be woven into the governance structure. So an example of that is the Australian wet tropics, which is a place where indigenous people have managed this for 4,000 years and aggressively managed fire in this landscape. And now, for the last 50 years or 40 years, it's been co-managed by indigenous people and the World Heritage Commission. You might wonder, what has the commission offered in 50 years when they had it for 4,000 years? But they are working together at least. So the sixth tendency, the fifth one, is this idea beyond the Western lens, the idea that in some way addressing indigenous communities, trying to understand what those local people at any spatial scale value, how they express management, how they understand management, and how we use that to change management practices. And then includes things like spirituality. Gorimi is a place in Turkey that has used this approach pretty successfully of weaving together values of indigenous people, the management practices of indigenous people, as well as this Western World Heritage Commission kind of an idea. And number 6, the last of our 6 tenets, is this idea of living heritage. When the World Heritage Commission looks at these sites, there's a phrase called authenticity or integrity. And basically it says, how consistently do the conditions of that site reflect the criteria we set up against it? So do they really meet the criteria through time? Are we tracking it pretty tightly here? The alternative to that is a different approach called living heritage that says there's a dynamic of change of social conditions and dynamic of that landscape. As long as there's congruence between the two, then it seems to be tracking well. So the people around the landscape and the people managing the landscape together have changing values. The landscape has changing conditions. As long as those two track together, we believe that that's tracking successfully rather than saying a static value. An example of that is East Dorset in England, where this is all an eroding landscape and it's rich with fossils all the way. And there's more erosion that occurs there every day. So every day, more of that falls away. It goes way back into the landscape. So it's a place of a dynamic situation where that's always new things to be shown. So it's a living, dynamic landscape kind of thing. Well, those 6 tenets, we think, would guide successful management of World Heritage Sites. There are some problems and opportunities associated with that. So we're not quite at implementation yet. Some of those are the idea of sustainable tourism. Tourism is a huge influence on World Heritage Sites. It's so big, it's $1.5 trillion, a trillion, God, see, I get my time, $1.5 trillion per year on tourism. And therefore, the potential to drive all kinds of decisions like this is what we want for conditions on the site, although that may be your view of World Heritage conditions. This influence of local hotels and tourism practices and so forth is so important. It can change on-site decisions. So one way that's done now, sustainable tourism idea, is to say, well, we value people from someplace else, where that is, coming to see our World Heritage Site. And we're going to do this in a way that says, we're going to be carbon neutral and we're going to be sensitive to biodiversity. We're going to use a non-Western lens to make sure that you understand the indigenous people who used to live here. We're going to do all kinds of things that will show how sensitive we are. And of course, we can't have very many people do that, and we need to make a profit margin. So it's very, very expensive. But it's going to be wonderful. Which basically says if you can afford it, we'd like to have you here. And I don't think that's a sustainable way. There's an awful lot of work done in sustainable tourism now, but I don't think they're there yet. I don't think yet we have an idea of getting that on the ground to manage these sites well. A second question about this is this idea of regenerative conservation. There's a fellow in Hawaii who's worked 50 years to restore a cave. The cave is an example of a cave. It's a pretty big cave. And over this 50-year period, this person, as well as a lot of other people involved with him, have restored conditions inside the cave to conditions that existed prior to European colonization. So all the plants and animals, the physical landscape, all the things are like it was before Europeans got to Hawaii 150 years ago. So the question is, if that's like it was before Europeans got there, is that heritage? Is that quality? Can you build a heritage site and say this is heritage now because it's like it used to be? In the same idea in Australia, there are places where a species lived in a landscape, and then as climates have changed, that species were forced to move away. Climates are now changing the other direction, so the conditions now at the lower site are like they were 10,000 years ago. If we go in and move that species down to the new conditions, so we've given it to, we've rebuilt a community, so to speak, at least moved the population down there to conditions that were like that 10,000 years ago. Does that qualify as heritage because it has some of the conditions that were true a long time ago? I think all those areas need further work, further thoughts. So I think the logic here, I think, is that society says these World Heritage Sites are unique, they're treasures, they're the best places on earth. We want a few people who will study those, work with them, manage them, and protect them from all the rest of us, and do it in a way that keeps them as solid as possible. So don't tolerate change out there because we want to be like they are, meet the criteria. That I think is an intractable situation. So I talked about the Great Barrier Reef and some other places, Venice, for example, and this dilemma that the World Heritage Commission has faced. And in my view, the commission is wrong because I think they have criteria, they have biophysical conditions, and the argument would be, if you don't meet the criteria, you do qualify as a site in danger. I'm sorry that threatens your economics, but that's a fact. Now we can change the criteria as we go forward and say, maybe because of a series of conditions, we redefine something, then apply new criteria. But at the moment, when doing the evaluation, you either meet the criteria or you don't. But so I think that there are many more sites in danger than are currently shown. There are about 265 World Heritage Sites, and today there are maybe 25 that are listed on the site as in danger. In World Heritage history over 50 years, there have been 2 that have actually removed from listing and said, you put you on site in danger, you didn't change successfully, you're done. We remove listing from you. So I think that it's important to recognize that these sites, both the biophysical condition and the criteria using our trajectories, and we're trying to use that management of our trajectory to maintain these sites in their conditions, maintain sites of value to society, not sites in their original condition. So one approach to this, one question about this would be, if these are the 6 tenets of World Heritage, Adaptive Heritage, where do you start? What work? We have a proposal right now to apply the Adaptive Heritage ideas to all World Heritage Sites in Australia. And that, I don't know, I call it a soft proposal because my co-author is Ian Gordon, who used to be head of climate change adaptation in Australia. And he is talking to people there about applying these things. It's not a proposal we wrote and said, give us money. It's sort of a discussion point, I guess I'd say. So the things that I'd like you to think about this and what's relevant, that we have natural landscapes, and they review those as valuable to society. Therefore, we declare them as World Heritage Sites. There are 6 tenets that I think would make management of these World Heritage Sites more adaptive, more responsive to society, and get around this dilemma that I phrased of failing to meet. None of these sites, none of these tenets I'm talking about are new. Each one of them is applied somewhere on the ground now, but I don't know of any place, including Ramsar and Bosphorus Reserve, where all those attributes are applied to any one given site. So I think that we're not going to find the right answer. We're going to continue to take risks. We're going to continue to fail. We're going to continue to deal with people at the management site, managing the World Heritage Site and the surrounding community, and try to weave that through an adaptive strategy. That's where I think it's all going. And look at that, Ken, we made it with 10 minutes to spare. So I'm happy to take conversations or questions or anything else about what this means and how we're going to get it done.
It's up here so you can look at the chat. There might be questions.
Can't read that little tiny words like that. You don't even wear glasses. How do you do that?
We have a question here. Go ahead.
That's very thoughtful. But one thing you posed was you can't identify a danger unless a threat or something, unless you know of a solution, sentence like that, or presentation.
Well, yes, I don't remember how I phrased it, but yes, you're right. That we have to, we recognize in these sites that there are, for example, erosion practices going on, and we have to collect data on those practices to recognize that there is a problem. The erosion rates are out of control. it's degrading the landscape or something. So the data, you need to have data on the site, be able to recognize that there is a problem.
If you say you can't identify problems unless you know the solution.
You could, you can certainly identify the potential for a problem. You can recognize, for example, that erosion might be a problem. You can't quantify it, which is the same as any place you would say on the Minnesota. I recognize that there's lots of erosion going on, and I can't quantify that until I measure it. Which might be the same conditions. I think I talked around that one. I've gotten quiet now. Yeah, Nick.
So I agree the world's changing. I also am a big fan of co-management. But I guess I would be concerned that society may, in some places, value land use, value tourism dollars over conservation. And then this adaptive strategy, society influence may let people or areas off the hook. And doing hard work to maybe not preserve it as it existed time ago, but let it degrade faster than.
Yeah, I think that's a major problem, because each of us are stakeholders to some degree in these World Heritage sites in Africa or someplace. The people who actually live next door are much more tightly bound, much more deeply interested stakeholders. So the logical argument to address your concern would be there are people around the edge of it and people on the site managing the site. Those two groups talk about values, interests, management strategies, but that's governed and controlled by the World Heritage Commission. So there's oversight by the Commission and by IUCN. I don't think that's effective today. So I contacted the World Heritage Commission and said, I have these ideas about adaptive heritage, and I think that might be interesting to you because you have a dilemma. You're going to find more and more places that don't meet criteria. You're going to figure out what to do with them. So I'll tell you what, I'll show up in Paris at my own expense, and all I need from you is a projector and an audience. And I don't want money. I don't want to change your operational guidance. I just invite you to a conversation. And they said, and so my co-author knows people in the World Heritage Commission as well. He wrote to them with the same argument, and they said, silence. So I think that there's this ostrich in the sand kind of thing that says the World Heritage Commission should be the ones who will be able to say the local community is valuing economics from tourism too highly. It's threatening that World Heritage site like the Great Barrier Reef and Venice. And therefore, we're going to control that to some degree. That's not being successful right now.
Retaining the title of a heritage site, Venice, for example, means a lot to them,
Yes.
but not enough to do the hard work to.
It's a mixture of economics and politics. So the commission says, we need to declare you a site in danger because you don't meet the criteria. But don't get grouchy about that. I mean, we really want to keep you as part, you know, we're delicate about that. And each of the individual places like Australia or Italy says, well, we're putting a lot of money in this. We're very nervous about this. You need to trust us. They'll work really hard to protect things. Pretty darn soon we'll get things better. And so far for 20 years, it's not been successful. Annually for 20 years in Venice, they said, we're going to get better soon by managing the big cruise ships. Thank you. I can't read these things.
Yeah, so we have a question here in chat from Bridget Tim. And Bridget asks, is tourism needed to help fund the management and monitoring of these sites, or are there other funding sources, especially in poor nations? And then she says, related to this, do you have any concerns on promoting tourism? So we kind of talked a little bit about this already, but I mean, are there any additional funds other than tourism?
Yeah, I think that all World Heritage sites are owned by the country in which they reside. And there are a few of these that are transboundary. There's a small amount of money available for each site from World Heritage Commission for the United Nations. Mostly the nation provides resources for monitoring and assessment. However, in places like the US, where there is an active tourism industry and it's woven into the fabric of society and fabric of the way we manage, there is money from that tourism industry that goes to help support the monitoring. So in some cases, it is well done and woven together. In most cases, it is not. Yeah.
So, I imagine a lot of these sites were nominated and whatever, end up trying to provide protections in those areas, but then there's also having those sites as a place to attract tourism or to have this, saying what's the tension between that, right? I mean, Venice, I don't know that. I think that is sort of like, oh, this ends up being a special place to brand it, and I got to find it. Whether it wasn't like, oh, this is going to be awesome, or nobody's ever going to see it. So how do you deal with that?
I don't think I understand the question. So you've got a place like Venice where it's highly visible and the water is woven right through the whole system. And the water quality is degraded so badly that people can't use the water. And it's primarily the cruise ships that are causing the problem. So,
but why did Venice become the World Heritage Site? That's why did it?
Oh.
Protection there, or was it provide publicity?
Yeah. So I think the principal issue is that to the nation and to the site itself, there's great marketing ability that says we are World Heritage, therefore look how great we are and so forth. I don't think when they go through the nomination process, they recognize that there might be problems, for example, with cruise ships. We might have to reduce tourism volume. Another example is Machu Picchu, where the tourism rate, the number of people coming in per year has escalated dramatically, and they've carried out a whole bunch of things now. So for a while, they would say, you can go up each day and you get a 4-hour pass or a 6-hour pass or whatever. They've cut that back down now to an individual gets one pass and it's for 3 hours and then you get back out. So each person, so you get limited access. So they're saying, we think that people will continue to come to us. People continue to spend money in our place. We'll continue to be a World Heritage Site and get the visibility from it by reducing this access from 8 hours to 3 hours and so forth. So they're willing to take that kind of a strategy. Venice, in contrast, has said, we need these big boats. We need these people to come in this way. We're going to work on it. And it hasn't been successful yet. But I think they're doing it for marketing reasons. James, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess thanks for. In comment about how to do this right, in case it's expensive. Practices, whatever. Community benefits from these resources, but does that just mean these are essentially mechanism of transferring wealth to local communities and the playgrounds for the wealthy? And are there ever mechanisms to also share this wealth with folks who don't have it, either in that country or elsewhere in the world? Is there other ways that, like, basically, it's not just a transfer of wealth in a playground village, those that we have with this place?
That's a big question. There certainly are ways that some of these places are involved in wealth transfer. And I think part of that is through this idea of sustainable tourism. So we said that if you come to our hotel or experience or whatever, it's on the World Heritage Site, you can see it on the Heritage Site. And part of the resources you leave here, part of the hotel experience, will benefit management of that side to change there. There's also around the edge of these World Heritage Sites, there are communities involved, things like marketing, crafts, or making it so that tourism experiences beyond seeing, and you can buy stuff and stuff like that. The idea of sustainable tourism, the idea of leading together people moving from place to place, carrying out some church experience, and $100 is
really big in my literature. But I don't know, I don't know if that has been successful anywhere in terms of what you're talking specifically about, leaving more dollars available for local people, using it as a way of not just wealth transfer, but actually social development. I don't know if that's.
I guess what I'm wondering is, I wonder if mechanism built into this heritage system, some set aside, so it's not just, because I mean, obviously the economic part is critical, right? Both for the management place and also for the, you know, for the, that's also that's some side effects. But it seemed like there could be some set aside as well to use that as, you know, educational opportunities that more otherwise disadvantaged youth or graduate students and countries to make sure that they can experience these things from their experiences, possibly make them sort of at a broader scale capable of being
Part of that is just educational, and I don't know if anybody's doing that now, but it seems to me it would best be done by a local organization, like a group of people, university, something like that, in a community, adjacent to their site, talking about collaboration and getting student opportunities. A related question you raised, however, is this idea of strengthening institutions, strengthening knowledge by co-management. So we have people in the surrounding community taking this wellhead site in a landscape context. So it's exciting, innovative landscape. People from the outside landscape and managing that wellhead site itself. Weaving that together and therefore increasing management skill, increasing knowledge, increasing science, and all of that. Yes, I think that's being done now. I mean, I can't give you an example of the words being done. Oh yeah, yeah, in South Africa, it's being done. That's being done. The place that I can't pronounce is something you thought. But I can't.
It's like we're over here a little bit too. So thanks, Jim, and thanks for putting up with all the technical difficulties, actually pulling it off. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you. I have a lot of books.